a little bit about the timeline of this Holy Week event, going from Thursday into Friday. There's a lot of action at this point, and the timeline actually begins with, if you combine all four of the Gospels, as we do with our birth narrative at Christmas. If you take all four of the Gospels and look at this Holy Week, and in particular this Thursday, Friday time frame, from 2 o'clock on Friday morning until sundown on Friday evening, there's a whole lot of stuff packed into this. Jesus, first of all, is betrayed by Judas. He is arrested. He is denied by Peter. There's 6 trials that take place just between 2 o'clock on Friday morning until he is actually put on the cross. He is beaten. He's crucified. He dies, and then he's buried. And all of that takes place in this very short amount of time. So a lot of things are happening as we do that. So on Thursday night, if you put the map up to start with, Mark. There we go. If you remember the city of Jerusalem, if you'll see the bottom left-hand corner, you see the upper room. The traditional location for that is somewhere in that vicinity. You have the upper room with Jesus. He sends the Seder Passover meal with the disciples. He initiates the Last Supper, and then he decides it's time to pray. And so sometime late in the night, possibly around midnight or so, he goes from the upper room, from the upper city down to the lower city, past the Pool of Siloam, and then up the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane over to the right that you see there. And it is there that he spends time in prayer. And then around 2 o'clock, Jesus is betrayed by Judas. He's arrested in Gethsemane, and he's taken to the former high priest house of Annas. And that's up, again, if you look at the map where the upper room is, right above that is the high priest house. Now, we don't actually know where Annas's house was, but it was probably a part of a high priest palace complex, which had several buildings to it. And Annas was probably, as the former high priest, living in one of those. And so they go to him first. And during that time frame, also Peter denies Christ for the first time. And then we have around 3 o'clock, Annas sends him to Caiaphas, which is, again, there at the high priest house in that general vicinity. He is sent there. There is a preliminary trial by the Sanhedrin. Peter denies him again. The soldiers mock and beat Jesus. And then sometime around 5:15 or so, Jesus is led to meet with the Sanhedrin for another trial, probably at the temple or there at the high priest house, somewhere in that vicinity. And then he is accused of claiming to be God. And it's at that point he says, "Yes, I am the Son of God." And so the Jews, the Sanhedrin condemns him at that point, but they can't do anything with him, so they send him to Pilate. And so Pilate is over at the Fortress Antonia that you see just on the other side of the temple there. So they walk across the city. And so they meet with Pilate. Now, this is 6 o'clock in the morning, and Pilate questions him. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about the trials usually happen very, very early in the morning. And so he meets with Pilate. Pilate finds out he's from Galilee, which is really the area of the country that Herod controls. And so he says, "I don't want to do anything with you. Let's go to Herod." And so he sent him to Herod. And so he walks across to Herod's palace that you'll see there on the map on the left. And so they send him over there. Herod Antipas questions Jesus, and Jesus doesn't speak. And so Herod says, "I don't have time for this. Go back to Pilate. Let Pilate deal with this." So sometime between 7:30 and 8:30 in the morning, Pilate tries several times to release Jesus, is what the scriptures say. And Pilate offers Barabbas as an alternative. The people don't want that, so Pilate speaks to Jesus, and Jesus, again, doesn't do much to help his own cause at this point. So he's sentenced by Pilate at that point. So he's flogged and scourged, and he is sentenced to death by crucifixion. The soldiers beat him, they spit upon him, they hit Jesus, and then Jesus is forced to carry, after he's been scourged and beaten up, to the patibulum, which is the cross beam on the cross. And so the stipes is left in the upper beam. The straight beam is left in a usual place for crucifixion, and then the person who's condemned has to carry the cross beam. And so we assume that's what Jesus did with that. And so at 9 o'clock in the morning, Jesus is crucified. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he has died. And then by sundown, Jesus is buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb nearby where the crucifixion is. So all of this is happening in that short amount of time. So if you look at the next picture, I want to just run through a couple of these real quickly. This is St. Peter's in Gallicantu. We heard Josh talk last week about the Sanhedrin and meeting with them. This is a location that is assumed to be a part of what was the complex of the high priest. And so you can see over the back left, the city of Jerusalem behind him. The next picture, please. This is the model again of the city of Jerusalem at the time of Christ. The upper left-hand corner where you see the orange-colored roofs is where the upper city would have been, and that is where Pilate, and that's where Caiaphas and all those folks would have been. Well, Pilate actually is at the Fortress Antonius. If you'll see there on the right around the circle, is where he would have had tried and probably scourged by the soldiers. Next picture. This is cross. You can see at the foot across at the top of the picture, the foot of the temple, but this is the complex is projected that Pilate would have been in. And so you can see the Fort Antonius back there, but this is also where Herod's palace would have been in this complex. The next picture, please. This is a drawing, and you can kind of get the outline in the pavement here. This is in the Fortress Antonia that you will see the games played by the soldiers. And the next picture actually has a drawing of what that pavement looks like. And you can see all kinds of games of chance that are in the pavement there. And all of these were used kind of like a Monopoly board was used to bet on and to throw the dice and to figure out who got the clothes and the other raiments of the condemned. And then the next the picture here. Here we go. And this is the church of, excuse me, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and the dome to the right up in that area. This is where the traditional site of the crucifixion and the burial of Christ is. The upper right-hand corner where that dome is where Golgotha would have been by tradition. The next picture shows you the tomb that is inside the tundra of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And then the next picture is the other traditional site. And on the map, you saw Golgotha. And at the very top of that, there was Gordon's Calvary. This was found much later in time, but it is reminiscent of the garden kind of atmosphere that would have probably been a part of the grave site. So this is an alternative site. We don't know where Jesus was actually buried, but we know traditionally the Church of the Holy Sepulchre area is more traditional. This is an alternative site to that. So anyway, those are just some pictures to give you a sense of that. But let's take a look at the actual text now. If you'll look at the 15th chapter, beginning with the first 5 verses here. At daybreak, the chief priests with the elders, legal experts, and the whole Sanhedrin formed a plan. They bound Jesus, led him away, and turned him over to Pilate. Pilate's questioned him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "That's what you say." The chief priests were accusing him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Aren't you going to answer? What about all these accusations?" But Jesus gave no more answers. So that Pilate marveled at Jesus. So the Sanhedrin, if you remember when I was talking about the schedule of times, really meets in the middle of the night. They're meeting because they're trying to conceal the business that they're doing. They're trying to avoid the crowds. The trials were normally held by the Romans at daybreak. And so it was important that they get their work done so that Pilate could receive Jesus and have it as the first case on the docket that morning, or very close to that. And so the Jewish leaders took Jesus to Pilate because they had no power to put Jesus to death. They had lost that power when the Romans took over. And there were times that they disregarded that prohibition that the Romans had on them, but not in this case. They could not take a chance that someone as politically popular as Jesus would be crucified by them, and then it would be their responsibility. One of the times that they kind of take it into their own hands is by tradition, the stoning of Stephen. Where the Sanhedrin actually let that take place, and the Romans didn't really care that much about Stephen. And so it was not a big deal. But for Jesus right now, during this high time of tension, if you want to call it that, in the holy city, with so many people from outside the city there, from around the world. So Pilate was known as a cruel and a ruthless man, but he didn't like the Jewish leaders very much. So he had no dog in this fight. He didn't really care whether the Jewish leaders got what they wanted or not. And he tried, it appears by the scriptures, to give Jesus an out, but Jesus doesn't take it. And so the Jews actually send, the Sanhedrin actually sends to Pilate with Jesus being condemned for treason, not because he's claiming to be God, but because he's claiming to be king of the Jews. Is what the charge is. And so Pilate receives that, and that's what he charges him with. This becomes a political charge more so than a religious one. But Jesus didn't defend himself. And so Pilate says he has no other choice but to find Jesus guilty. Moving on to verse 6 through 15. During the festival, Pilate released one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. A man named Barabbas was locked up with the rebels who had committed murder during an uprising. The crowd pushed forward and asked Pilate to release someone, as he regularly did. Pilate answered them, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" He knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of jealousy, but the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have them release Barabbas to them instead. Pilate replied, "Then what do you want me to do with this one called the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What wrong has he done?" They shouted even louder, "Crucify him." Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd, so he released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus whipped and handed him over to be crucified. It appears that Pilate really doesn't think that the charges against Jesus are real. He's an innocent man. In fact, Luke records for us that Pilate says, I found no fault with this man. What is it that you're wanting me to do? And yet Pilate had a very politically explosive situation on his hand. There are a lot of people from around the world that are in town, and it's almost like Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Things can get out of hand very quickly if things are not held in check. And so Pilate is concerned about having an uprising on his hand, and if he does, then Rome's going to get involved, and that's never pretty with that. So the people choose Barabbas. And it's not the people, it is really the Jews who live in Jerusalem at this point. And it's probably folks that are related to the Sanhedrin, more so than it is the regular people who were praising him on Palm Sunday. And so they choose Barabbas. And Barabbas is an insurrectionist, which means like a terrorist. He is somebody that has plotted against the government. And so he, as you heard in the text, is convicted because he has murdered those in an uprising. And so the people then cry for Jesus to be the one to be crucified, and they want Barabbas released. Now, Jesus at this point is scourged, and by tradition, Jesus has 39 lashes across his back with whips that have barbed wire kind of bone chips and things like that will tear the flesh upon the back. And it was 39 slashes because the tradition was if you have 40, you would die. And so they have 39 slashes across the back, just one short of what would potentially be his death. And so the 40 lashes aren't quite achieved, but Jesus is weak and he's beaten up and he's bleeding. And so he is asked to then carry his cross shortly. And how does he do that when he's in such terrible shape? And of course, they do all this so that the crucifixion doesn't take very long. So we move to verse 16 then, 16 through 20. The soldiers led Jesus away into the courtyard of the palace known as the governor's headquarters and called together the whole company of soldiers. They dressed him in a purple robe and twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on him. They saluted him, "Hey, King of the Jews." Again and again they struck his head with a stick. They spit on him, knelt before him in honor of him. When they finished mocking him, they stripped him of his purple robe and put his own clothes back on him. Then they led him to be crucified. A Roman king was an entity who wore purple robes and also had a gilded wreath of leaves around their head. And so they're mocking Jesus by giving him a purple robe, which was probably a castaway piece of cloth. And then they also stuck this fake crown upon his head. And the whole purpose of this was, of course, to mock Jesus. Normally they would have upheld Caesar by saying, "Hail Caesar, hail Caesar." But what we hear here is, "Hail King of the Jews," as they make fun of him in this very difficult time after he's already been beaten and scourged. They bow down on a knee, and usually they would bow before the king, Caesar, and they would bow before him and they would kiss his hand. But they do the very opposite of Jesus. They mockingly bow before him and they spat upon him. Jesus was required, as all condemned men were, to carry the cross. And as I mentioned, that was the patibulum. That was the crossbeam part. And usually that weighed somewhere between 75 to 100 pounds. It was a heavy piece of wood to carry. And the whole cross itself, if you carried the whole thing, probably would have been close to 300 pounds. So our tradition is usually we see folks carrying the entire cross upon their back. Traditionally, it would have been just this patibulum, that piece that goes across the top of the cross. With that, and with that, he's tied upon this heavy piece of wood, and so Jesus is weak. He's got a long way to go from the fortress to the Golgotha, and so he falls on a number of occasions. And obviously, if you're tied to this piece of wood, the only thing you can do when you fall is hit face first. So this is another piece of the punishment. If you can't carry yourself, then you're going to injure yourself as you continue to walk farther towards them. So we get the verse 21. Simon, a man from Cyrene, Alexander and Rufus his father, was coming in from the countryside. They forced him to carry Jesus's cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means skull place. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. Now, Simon is not a Roman. He's a foreigner, and by tradition, he was from North Africa. So he has come to be in Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. And he is there, and they just conscript him. They just pull him from the crowd. Obviously, he is not from there, and so they just pull him in. And the tradition was that these three men who are a part of this story become Christians later on. In fact, two men become Christians later on. And Rufus is even mentioned in the 16th chapter of the book of Romans as one who is a part of the founding of the early church. They brought Jesus means that they actually had to probably carry Jesus the last part of the trip. They brought him in a way that they lifted him up and carried him just to get him to the point of crucifixion. The wine mixed with myrrh would have been a deadening pain for the pain, and it was usually provided by the women at the cross. They had compassion on those who had been condemned, so anything they could give to help deaden the pain of what they're going to go through, they were willing to do. Then verse 24, they crucified him. They divided up his clothes, drawing lots for them to determine who would take what. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The notice of the formal charges against him were written, "The King of the Jews." It's interesting in the scriptures, there really needs to be no explanation of crucifixion. It just says very, very flatly and bluntly, they crucified him. And everybody at the time of this reading would have known what that meant. The Romans did not invent crucifixion, but they perfected it to a form of extreme torture. They had it down pat how to keep you alive long enough that they got what they wanted out of it, but it also was excruciating for that. In fact, the word excruciating comes from a word related to crucifixion because the pain was so great. And they divided their clothes. Was a fulfillment of the prophecy that we find in Psalm 22, the 18th verse, because it talks there about the foretelling of the coming of the Messiah and what that would be like, and the fact that he would have all of his clothes divided, which was tradition among the Jews. Men were crucified naked usually, except the Romans had an understanding with the Jews that they usually wore a loincloth with that. But normally those to be condemned and to be crucified would have been so as a naked individual. But there was some modesty that was given to the Jews. Verse 27 through 32 is they crucified two outlaws with him, one on his right side and one on his left. People walking by insulted him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha, so you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, were you? Save yourself and come down from that cross." In the same way, the chief priests were making fun of him among themselves, together with the legal expert. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross. Then we'll see and believe. Even those who had been crucified with Jesus insulted him. Jesus is not only mocked by the Romans, but he's also mocked by the religious leaders. And it was the norm for anyone to be crucified, to be mocked by those who walked by. The crucifixion was on the main road leading out of Jerusalem. And so people coming into town and people leaving town would have taken their shots at whoever's crucified also. And it's because he didn't come down that we believe in him. Jesus could have come down. He could have missed all of this, but he chose to be our Savior. And for that reason, he makes a statement of faith by staying there on the cross. He did something greater than coming down from the cross. He ended up rising from the dead, a significant event that we proclaim this day. Then the 33rd verse through the 37th. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, the whole earth was dark. At 3, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you left me? After hearing him, some standing there said, look, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, and put it on a pole. He offered it to Jesus to drink, saying, let's see if Elijah will come to take him down. But Jesus let out a loud cry and died. The remarkable darkness that we have here is for 3 hours. By theology, it is shows the agony that the creation was actually in. For 3 consecutive hours, it is dark. Some would proclaim that to be a solar eclipse. There's a Roman historian, who talks about that taking place during this time frame, that it also was an earthquake during that time. So by history and tradition, it is a time of darkness and a time the earth shook at the death of Christ. My God, why have you left me? Why have you forsaken me, is what some translations say, which again goes back to the 22nd chapter of Psalm. Jesus declares that he has fulfilled the agony as well as the victory of the prophecy of the cross. People misunderstood what he was saying, and they're thinking he's calling out for Elijah, the head prophet, to come back and to save him. But in reality, he is just crying out to God. And John says that Jesus cries out, it is finished, the last words from the cross. And the ultimate gift of God's love for our humanity is the gift of this sacred Son. Verses 38 through 41, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. When the century who stood facing Jesus saw how he died, he said, this was certainly God's Son. Some women were watching from a distance, including Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, the younger one, and Joseph and Salome. When Jesus was in the Galilee, these women had followed him and had supported him, along with many other women who had come to Jerusalem with him. So the tearing of the curtain meant that this is in the temple. And by tearing the curtain, the Holy of Holies is now accessible. The throne of grace is now acceptable to all people. The centurion had watched many, many people die in his position, we assume. And he is so moved by the way in which Jesus has carried himself and the sacrifice that he has made. Surely this is someone that is special, the Son of God. And most faithful disciples were revealed at that point, and it's noted that they are women who have come and supported Jesus throughout his ministry and also supported him in his crucifixion. And then to finish up, verses 42 to 47. Since it was late in the afternoon on preparation day, just before the Sabbath, Joseph from Arimathea dared to approach Pilate and ask for Jesus' body. Joseph was a prominent council member who also eagerly anticipated the coming of God's kingdom. Pilate wondered if Jesus was already dead. He called the centurion and asked him whether Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that Jesus was dead, Pilate gave the dead body to Joseph. He brought a linen cloth, took Jesus down from the cross, wrapped him in the cloth, and laid him in a tomb that had been carved out of rock. He rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was buried. So Joseph must have been, he's on the council, he's part of the Sanhedrin, but evidently he was quiet at the time that Jesus was on trial. Maybe he's afraid, maybe he hasn't been quite moved to respond at this point, but he watches Jesus be sentenced to death. But now he comes forward. He's not ashamed to let Pilate and others know that he cares for this man. Joseph did what no other person could do at this point. Everyone else has left. No one else has the money. Nobody else has the tomb. Normally, bodies would stay on the cross. Once you've been crucified, you stayed there until your body either rotted off or they needed to have it for another crucifixion. So to have someone take care of a body this way was a wonderful gift. It was important for Joseph that Jesus not remain on the cross for Passover. He is a Jew. This is a high holy time, the highest holy time of the Jewish tradition. And so he wants to make sure that Jesus is cared for in a proper way. We all must serve God, and he's done what he could do as an individual. He's done what any individual could do at this point for him. And so because it is near sundown in the beginning of Passover, you'll see that Jesus is just wrapped in a cloth at this point. The women will not come until a later time to prepare the body, and we'll hear that story next week. So let us move now to our discussion questions around the table, so to speak.
All right, so I'm posting in the chat if you're a table leader. If you would just copy, you should actually see this when I move you to your rooms. But copy it just in case. I'm going to go ahead and do the breakouts now. Stop this recording.